So welcome everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Amy Ryan and I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Montana. And I'm just going to say a few words about the council. Most of you are members, I think, but for those of you who aren't, I just want to introduce you. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization located here in Missoula, Montana. And we're part of a larger organization called the World Affairs Council of America. And it's the largest organization of its kind in the country doing international education outreach and global affairs education. So it's we've got 90 chapters across the state, and we're the Montana branch, and we've got big shoes to fill, and we're excited to be doing the work we're doing. The council was founded by Ambassador Mark Johnson, who is a Montana native who served 30 years in the Foreign Service and has since retired in Missoula and wanted to give back to the Missoula community and then, of course, the greater Montana state. So he founded the council in 2000. And we've since grown into this larger organization, and we're excited to have you all here with us today. We have a couple different programs that we do to fulfill this mission of educating Montanans about the world around them, and I just want to tell you a little bit about those. Our largest, and what we are part of right now, is called our Distinguished Speakers Program, and this includes community discussions such as this one, when we bring in an expert or a dignitary or an ambassador of sorts. And we give the community a chance to engage with them and learn firsthand. We also do business luncheons with them, so gathering business leaders and different folks from around the community for a more intimate chance to get to know our speakers. And then some high school visits, some local high school visits that we bring our speakers into. We also do global education initiatives. Our largest is called Academic World Quest, and this is sort of a global gauntlet, international relations, current events competition for high school students. We have students coming from around the state to compete in this. Last year we had over 250. We're the third largest competition in the nation. Other World Affairs Councils do this, and students come to Missoula from around the state to compete, to go to Washington, D.C. to compete at the national level. So it's a full-day event, and it's really exciting. It gives these students an opportunity to engage in international affairs and current events in a way that sometimes a classroom can't do on its own. So we also have Counsel in the Classroom, which is our newest education initiative, and Brandon Bastide was able to do that today, and that's our sort of video conferencing live webcast with students around the state. So we're really wanting to live up to our name, the World Affairs Council of Montana, and with our limited resources, we've partnered with a local company called Alter Enterprise, and they do this video conferencing with schools around the state. And so we've been able to connect with Livingston and Chinook, and then some homeschool students down the Bitterroot, and then some students also from, maybe it was Moore today? I think the last one was Moore. I think I said Chinook. Anyways, really exciting a way for these students who otherwise wouldn't get the opportunity to meet someone like Brandon Bastide. And last spring we had the former Afghan ambassador. So some really interesting speakers that we're able to bring into these classrooms so that they can have a real live discussion with them and learn firsthand. And then we also do teacher workshops, which is a way for us to reach teachers and then, of course, the broader classrooms. We mostly do these workshops on Turkey. We get a grant from the Turkish Cultural Foundation to do workshops with teachers here in the state, and then we send them over to Turkey, and they have a 14-day amazing study tour, and then they come back and teach their communities and classrooms about what they've learned. So those are just some of sort of a quick and dirty overview of our programs. I encourage you, we've got some membership brochures out in the lobby if you're interested. And most of you are members, but if you're not, I encourage you to check that out. And so if you're not a member, I also encourage you to become one. All of our funding is private. We get it from memberships and donors and grants. We're not federally funded in any way, so I encourage you to become a member if you're interested in what we do. If you are a member, thank you for joining us, and thank you for being here to support us. And speaking of support, I want to thank our wonderful interns. We've got Liocat and Shannon and Damara and Kyle. I think they're spread out, and I think some are still out there. So thank you to them. Our university interns really do make these opportunities possible. They do all the grunt work for us and make these things happen. And then I'd also like to thank Aubrey Lyons. Many of you know her. She was our previous executive director and really made the council what it is today, grew it from a tiny office with Ambassador Mark Johnson into a full-fledged nonprofit. So thank you for all your work. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Global Educator of the Year. It's a new program that we're starting, and we really wanted to honor a Montana teacher who goes above and beyond what's required of them in the classroom to bring their students international education opportunities. So both in the classroom and in the community, what are they doing to make sure that those around them are having these opportunities for hands-on learning and resources. And so we got a pool of nominations from around the state this summer, and a committee from the council, some board members and community members gathered and chose tonight's honoree. It was a tough decision to make, as everyone who was nominated is doing outstanding work around the state, and so that's exciting. That was such a hard choice, but we know we've picked the right guy for our first ever Montana Global Educator of the Year award. I do just want to say that the recipient of this award will also receive a $250 donation from the council to their school library, and this will be used for international resources. And this donation on behalf of the council was made by Dr. Edwin and Janet House. Edwin is our newest board member, and for many reasons, we're thrilled to have him as part of our team. And I just wanted to extend a warm welcome to our honoree, Jeff Hubble. Did I say that right? Okay. Who is also here with his wife Tara and his parents and mother-in-law, and the Great Falls High School Associate Principal Julie Tremelli. So thank you for making the trip from Great Falls and joining us. We're honored that you're here with us today. So now I get the honor of introducing one of our guests this evening, Dr. Shannon O'Brien. Dr. O'Brien is Governor Bullock's Education Policy Advisor. She studied political science at the University of Washington and earned a master's degree from Gonzaga University, and then went on to complete her doctorate in educational leadership at the University of Montana. In addition to living in Spain, England, and Russia, she spent last spring semester in Perth, Australia. So talk about world affairs. We've got somebody who's in the know right here. Dr. O'Brien has taught at the college level as well as high school social studies and coached multiple sports before shifting her professional pursuits to the field of college access, where she worked with policymakers to identify the challenges and possible solutions for students who are ethnic minority or live in poverty. So some powerful and important work, and we're thrilled that she's here today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shannon O'Brien.
Thank you, Amy. Good evening. It is a great honor to represent Governor Steve Bullock and Lieutenant Governor John Walsh. They both send their great regrets for not being able to be here this evening. And as you may have heard, the governor has is in the process now of completing a back-to-school tour where we've visited 15 schools in it's actually a total of 7 days, and everything from early learning environments in Great Falls to in middle schools to higher education locations and all throughout the state. And it was a meaningful experience for the governor to learn and share and find out what's going on, many of the great things that are going on in our state and some of the opportunities that he can help, where he can help. Our governor is absolutely committed to supporting teachers in our state in helping them reach the needs of each and every learner. And that is the primary purpose that we are here tonight, is to recognize one of our great teachers. We would like to thank the people who do the work of the World Affairs Council, and through their programming help people see and broaden different ways of thinking. And I have had the great opportunity to be able to do some traveling and to live other places and see other ways of doing things, and that pure form of education is invaluable. And during this time of accountability and issues in education that are great challenges, it's often government and civics and social studies and history that aren't as recognized and are at risk of being deprioritized. So it's organizations like this that help keep that alive. It is now time to recognize the most important person in the room tonight. And I am absolutely thrilled to do this in a little bit of a unique way. We have in our office one of our policy advisors, one of the governor's policy advisors, happens to be a former student of our Global Teacher of the Year. So I have before me a letter written to Mr. Hobble from Dave Kuntz, who's a former student. Dear Mr. Hobble, on behalf of the countless students who have participated in warfare, stayed up all night memorizing all 56 of Montana's counties, and found their lifelong passion in your classroom, congratulations on your award as the Global Educator of the Year. I can't think of a more deserving person for this recognition. When I saw you were selected for this honor, I couldn't help but think of some of the successes in my life and the role you have played in shaping those. Your classes helped me develop a passion for public policy and led me to the University of Montana, where I majored in political science and have since entered the career field of my dreams, a career field I only knew was possible after your guidance. Not only were you my MVT, most valuable teacher, but you were there for me after I was done wandering the hallway of Great Falls High, providing me with resources to help me reach my potential. I want to thank you for the effort you put into your teaching. I don't know where I would be without it. Your ability to inspire your students is a skill that not all of your peers have. For that, I am forever grateful. We are approaching a decade since I was in your classroom, but I will always consider myself your student. Thanks for everything. Sincerely, Dave Kuntz, Governor's Office, Associate Policy Advisor.
Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. You guys need to realize that these kids are good before I ever touch them. A lot of them, they're just great kids. I want to thank, obviously, Ambassador Johnson for getting this going, Aubrey and Amy and everybody else that goes into this. This is quite the thing. I struggle most days being the best person in the classroom, let alone being the best and getting recognized for anything like that. So this is quite an honor, and I greatly appreciate everything that has happened. I thank Mrs. Tremelli for being here. I thank our Assistant Superintendent, Tom Moore, apparently was one of the ones that put my name in. It's easier for me to live in my little bubble in my classroom and just be that guy than it is to accept something that I feel like I don't really deserve. I'm just me and the kids are them, and I try to establish some good relationships with them. When Aubrey gave me the phone call, I thought she was a telemarketer. I told her earlier that I was maybe going to hang up on her, and so I apologize for that. But she asked me to maybe say a few words about why I got into teaching, why I like history, why I like social issues etc., and how I work that in. To me, it's always kind of come natural. I've always loved history. I'm not exactly sure what the initial thing that drew me in was, but I know that I've been intrigued for a very long time. I think for me it's been about emotions and the emotions that go along with all of the events that happen and have happened in my life. For instance, I remember as a very, very young child, just small tidbits of Vietnam. I don't remember much about it, but I remember hearing some things, and I know it was kind of sad. I remember watching the events play out in Iran when I was 8 years old, and the emotions that went along with President Carter trying to rescue those hostages, and then seeing the helicopter crash in the desert. And I just remember, oh my God, those are some dads and some brothers. And that was just that kind of got me hooked with so many events. I remember when I was 9, I celebrated on February 22nd, 1980, when the Miracle on Ice happened. Just jumping up on the couch and all excited for those hockey players over there that beat the Soviets. I didn't really know why. I couldn't tell you what the Cold War was. Didn't have a clue, but I know that I was envious of those guys. I know that I was excited for them. I know that it meant a lot to me and the rest of the United States that we won. A couple months later, I remember my mom sending me off with a handkerchief across my mouth because Mount St. Helens exploded. And snow drifts, ash drifts on streets and everything else. And here I am, 9 years old, walking to school, and it's kind of cloudy outside. Didn't think much of it, but I remember the apprehension that went along with the explosion of Mount St. Helens. 1 year later, almost to the day, I remember sitting in Dutton, in the small cafe in Dutton, Montana, and hearing about the Pope getting shot. As a Catholic, being raised Catholic, that was a big deal. And I didn't know a lot about it other than he was shot, and it's scary. I remember, as many of you do, the shock, the sadness, the tears, watching live on TV when everybody's glued to their TV, classrooms around the world glued to their TVs watching Chris McCullough go up in the Challenger, and it goes up and then it just disappears. And it was crazy. It was so sad. All of those experiences, among a lot of others I had before I turned 16, seemed to shape who I am today. I noticed that I try to approach history as just a bunch of stories. I told the kids just the other day, because we just started school, that history has the word story in it. And that's really what it is. It's a bunch of experiences that people have. And why we need to learn it is because somebody needs to tell their story. If we don't learn the story, we can't tell the story. And some people don't have a voice. I frequently ask my students to put themselves in a position other than their own. Be that 15-year-old girl from war-torn Afghanistan who's just like you. Is she that much different? She's not. Does she have hopes and dreams? Yeah. Does she want peace? Yeah. Do you think she's ever felt love? Yeah. Nervous, excitement, envious, sad? All of those, they're just like you. And that's how I try to approach the course. Of course she feels like that. Students in Montana and throughout the United States today, with a simple flick of the thumb, can access more information than the entire federal government could in the 1970s and 80s. We just have to get them to want to. They can look up 100 different languages in 1,000 different countries, hundreds of different countries. They can watch anything in real time. We just, again, have to get them to want to. One of the most important things I've learned about teaching kids is that kids will care if they know that you care first. I've learned that I can't force an important event or issue on students, but I sure can do my best to help them understand why events matter. Kids are different today, we know that, in many ways. But they're the same kid that I grew up with. They're the same Jeff Hobble in a class of 16 in Dutton, America in the 1980s. They laugh, they get excited, they get nervous, they experience sadness, love, envy, and pride. By understanding emotions and the experiences that go along with it, I think that is what I have tried to do. I've tried to establish relationships. And I don't know, I guess some kids I guess I'm here, so I've done something kind of right, I guess. But I thank you very much for this award. I don't feel like I deserve it because I don't know that I've done anything any better than anybody else. But I greatly appreciate it, and more than you'll probably know. So thank you very much.
Before we let you off the hook, we have a small token of our appreciation for all of your dedication to connecting our students with important global issues. It's your our first ever Global Educator of the Year.
That is awesome.
As well as a letter from our founder, Ambassador Mark Johnson, who's also a Great Falls native, and couldn't be here today. He's traveling overseas, but he sends his congratulations and regrets that he can't be here himself.
Thank you
If you'd like to share that, thank you.
I appreciate it.
Should also thank Jeff for taking my phone call and not hanging up when he thought I may be a telemarketer. We're competing with some Monday Night Football this evening, so I'd like to thank you all for coming and joining us. We have an exciting opportunity this evening to hear from our distinguished speaker, Mr. Brandon Bastide, who is with the Executive Director of the Gallup Education in DC and leads the development of Gallup's education work. We've had a busy day, and he has a lot of exciting things to share with us. His career spans a wide range of important work in education as an educational entrepreneur, speaker, writer, and university trustee. His mission is to create a national movement to measure the educational outcomes that matter most, connect education to jobs and job creation, and promote a paradigm shift from knowledge mastery to emotional engagement in education, which is excited to hear more about. He's a nationally known speaker and author on education policy and public health, with work featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, to name a few. He's received his degree in public policy from Duke University, and this is his first visit to Montana. We've packed his 36 hours here full of meetings and engagements, so hopefully he'll make it back and be able to enjoy a little bit more next time. So please join me in welcoming Brandon Bastide.
So let me just ask, can you hear me if I'm not on that mic? I might bounce around a little bit. I prefer to do it, especially with an intimate group, which is terrific. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation to be here. Checking off one of my important bucket list opportunities. This is my 48th state, right? So I've got 2 left, Idaho and Utah. I was thinking about making a run for the border tonight to squeeze in Idaho, but I'm probably going to be out of steam by the time we're done today. So I'm delighted to be here. And I actually have some family history tied to Montana, interestingly enough. I believe, technically speaking, it's my great-grandfather, who was George Drewyer, who was one of the lead interpreters on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And he married a Shoshone woman, and we believe met her in Montana. So the records are a little shady on that, but at least a distant relative fell in love with Montana here and helped carve out the manifest destiny of the country. So I'm delighted to be here. It's a real pleasure. I'm going to do a couple things tonight. One, try to be very provocative. Okay, that's part of my job, and I'm going to try and do it through the lens of a lot of very powerful research. So everybody knows the Gallup organization because of our polling. It's actually the smallest piece of what we do as an organization, but it's obviously the most known. Gallup is literally sitting on the world's largest research platform. So very briefly, a lot of these insights I'm going to share with you tonight come from, for example, our world poll, where we are statistically sampling 98% of the world's population every year. We have representative sampling frames in over 160 countries, right? Think of all the different language translations, all the different ways that we have to do representative sampling. Many countries, it's the old-fashioned way of walking out into fields and interviewing people at food pots and literally stuff like that. So we've been administering the World Poll for about a decade now. We've been measuring well-being of people around the world. We do that in the U.S. through our Gallup nightly poll every night, where we interview a representative sample of Americans. We also run the Gallup student poll, which is a poll of 5th through 12th graders in the United States. And probably the biggest piece of business that Gallup does as an organization is measuring workplace engagement for employees across businesses, nonprofits, government agencies, and customer engagement for some of the world's best customer brands like the Ritz-Carlton. So all of that actually has a lot of interesting elements when it comes to education. Let's just start real quick with the fact that we are in a total state of upheaval in education, not just in the U.S., but around the world, right? So there's all these different influences that are coming down upon it. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but I want to start off with some hard-hitting points right away. The first of which is, if I've got this going right, that I'm going to explain this a little bit later, but I would submit to you that our biggest problem right now in education, and I would say this is true across both K-12 and higher education, is two things, two very fundamental things. One, that we are primarily looking at education through a deficit-based lens. Most of our conversations, most of the ways that we're trying to fix problems is through the lens of a deficit-based model, right? We're constantly complaining about what's wrong with schools, how ineffective teachers are, and what students don't know. And we've even created a system that encourages that, and I'll explain what I mean a little bit. I would also submit to you that we are aiming at the wrong ultimate outcomes. Now, I want to be very clear. The things I'm listing on this today, SAT scores, GPA, graduation, right? These are the things that we're measuring now. They're not ultimate outcomes. At best, they're intermediate outcomes, right? Flags that you knock over on the way to ultimate outcomes. But if we think that we've accomplished our goal by simply getting a kid to graduate, that's an important milestone. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But if we think that's the ultimate end game of getting a diploma that says I graduated, we've got another thing coming. Quick stat, about 50% of recent college graduates are in jobs that don't require a college degree. There's obviously a lot of things going on there, a misalignment between the degrees conferred in the United States, the jobs that are available, but there's a whole host of other things going on. But just getting that degree does not necessarily mean we've achieved success for that student or for our country. So those are two opening points. Now, we just announced this data in January. We called it the school cliff. This was right around the time of the fiscal cliff, if you'll recall. So it grabbed a lot of attention. But what we're measuring is engagement in school. I'll explain briefly what we mean by engagement. And what you're looking at here is engagement from elementary to middle to high school. 76% of students are engaged in elementary school, drops to 61 by middle school, drops to 44 by high school. And if I showed you this every year in school, it literally goes down every year. So if this was a chart of 5th grade, 6th grade, it just keeps going down. So actually seniors in high school, the engagement rate's about 38% because that 44 is an aggregate of 9 through 12. Now, the simple point, if we were doing this right, that line should be going in the opposite direction. Kids should be getting more engaged each year they go through school. And what we see at a national level is that they're literally getting less engaged for every extra year that they're in school, right? Something has to change around this. Now, we've spent the last 20 years focused on initiatives like No Child Left Behind, right? We got very concerned with how we were doing in standardized test performance, particularly math and science. We got all fired up about that. We said, well, we got to improve these standards. So we've been spending 20 years focusing on standardized testing performance. We have not moved the needle in 20 years. We haven't gotten worse, but we haven't gotten any better. And at the same time in those 20 years, there's a lot of other countries whose standardized test scores have improved dramatically, right? We are all worked up in a frenzy of this. The U.S. hates to be ranked anywhere in the teens, let alone not number one, right? Whether we're talking about the Olympics and what the gold medal count is and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I don't know what the latest rankings were in PISA, 19th in math, 20s, I don't know. I mean, 19s and 20s is where we're ranked. So we're all in a frenzy about this, right? And I don't want to undermine the importance of this kind of testing, but I want to be provocative about thinking about some different ways of getting at this. So let's just talk about some of the forces happening in the world around education right now. This one is an interesting one, that education, knowledge, actually, is trending towards free. The cost of knowledge is trending towards free right now. Khan Academy, right, edX, all these MOOCs, what they call them, massive open online courses. By the way, before all these things became really trendy, several years ago, you could take every single course offered by MIT online for free. I was in a conversation waiting for a coffee, talking to one of my friends about this 5 years ago, and this woman behind me said, yeah, I'm actually taking one of those courses at MIT. And I said, really? How? What do you mean? She says, well, I'm a student at Wellesley. And I said, what do you mean? She's like, well, I'm getting credit for taking one of the courses at MIT. And I just started thinking about the implications of all these things. Think about this. You can take every course at MIT for free right now. You could 5 years ago. You just can't get the degree, right? But so as you think about the cost of knowledge going towards free, what's also happening to knowledge? It's expanding exponentially in this world, right? The rate of knowledge is expanding exponentially. So here's the big so what. Kids, adults in the future, right, are no longer going to compete on what they know. It's impossible to know everything you need to know in a particular field, right? Even subject matter experts can't know everything they need to know in their particular field. It's how they apply that knowledge. It's what they do with that knowledge, right? It's how they put that knowledge to the greater good of society, etc. that's really going to matter. So they're not going to compete on what they know ever again. The other thing that's, of course, exacerbating this problem is that the cost of education, college degree in particular, has skyrocketed. So in the last 18 years, college education has gone up 248%. This is tuition. Healthcare costs, by the way, in that same time frame have only gone up about 124%. So we're having a national conversation right now about how healthcare is bankrupting the United States, which it is, by the way. It's about a $2.5 trillion cost for healthcare in the United States. That's bigger than the entire GDP of Russia right now. So Jeff was talking about the Cold War, right? I mean, Soviets, I mean, you know, literally our healthcare tab is now bigger than the entire GDP of Russia, just to put things in perspective, right? So, but long story short is, we have this big national conversation about healthcare costs skyrocketing out of control. Higher education tuition has beat that 2x in the last 18 years. So, this obviously is creating a question in the minds of many Americans for the first time in our history, if you can believe this, as to whether college is worth it. There are a lot of Americans asking that question, is college worth it? Can you imagine that? I mean, this is something that's always been intimately tied to the college, to the American dream, right? The idea of going to college, if you go to college and get a degree, your life is going to be better. It's always considered kind of a magical ingredient for success in the United States. There's a lot of people questioning whether or not college is worth it. We did a representative poll of parents in the U.S. who have kids in 5th through 12th grade. We just did this 6 months ago. We actually asked them what they saw as a path to a good job for their kid. Number 1 was technical or career training. Number 2 was no college at all. Number 3 actually was a liberal arts degree. Think about that. Okay, so a couple of little quick points. Liberal arts, as a word, doesn't really compute with most Americans, right? Unless you have a parent who got a liberal arts degree, you understand really what it is. What does compute with them, though, is things like 21st century skills. So ironically, what are those? Those are things like skilled communication, collaboration, critical thinking, right? That is suspiciously liberal arts in description. My point about this is that we've got some branding issues, we've got very real issues, but we have this fundamental thing of Americans questioning the value of a college degree. So in the end here, we're not very satisfied with the results. About half of Americans don't perceive college graduates as ready for work. They're probably right. There's other data that I mentioned before, about 50% of college graduates are in jobs that don't require a college degree. So we certainly have a lot of outcomes here that we're not happy with. But let me just pause, because I think it's interesting to ask a simple question. By the way, no surprise, we've been doing polling data on perceptions of public schools, and it's just been going down since the 1970s, since we started measuring of this. What's interesting, though, is if you ask Americans to rate schools nationally, they don't give them a very good report card. But the closer you get to their school, the better the ratings are. So when you say, well, what about your school in Great Falls? You're like, oh, no, our school's really good. There's an important thing about this, right? The closer you are to what's happening in education, the better it is. And the reality is that it's probably true, right? If I know certain teachers and I know what's going on in the classroom, in most places, they're doing a fair job, right? You actually, the more you know it, the more you like it. But nationally, of course, we've seen confidence in public schools plummeting dramatically. So I think it's interesting, though, to look at how we're measuring things right now, because this is a big part of the story that I opened up with, that we're aiming at the wrong ultimate outcomes. Now, on the left are essentially the criteria that drive U.S. News and World Report rankings. Okay? They are essentially the selectivity of the institution, right? In terms of how many students they turn away, what their average SAT scores were, ranked in class, GPA, a little bit of this is what's the size of the endowment, what's the teacher to student, ratio, right? But for the most part, U.S. News and World Report rankings are driven by inputs, not outcome measures. No one is measuring Harvard on the learning growth of their students from freshman year to graduation. No, they're just measuring how selective Harvard was in recruiting students with the highest SAT scores. But we are treating U.S. News and World Report rankings as outcome measures, because when parents and students go to look at where they should go to college, inevitably they're pulling up those rankings. Well, this is the top rated, blah, 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 right? So, and by the way, I enjoy and appreciate the work that the folks at U.S. News and World are doing, because guess what? They're only measuring the things that schools are reporting on right now. If schools were reporting on different metrics, they would include those in their rankings, right? So this is not certainly a critique on U.S. News and Report. Now, on the right-hand side, I wish this list was longer. I wish this list was a little more sophisticated, but it's not. This is essentially the national standards we have for measuring schools and colleges in the United States. This is what we do, right? We have GPA. By the way, GPA in the last 30 years has gone up a full point. Okay, so we're experiencing a period of rapid grade point inflation. So it's gone up a whole point. So those of you who got a degree 30 years ago, add a point, and that's what your GPA would be today. It makes you feel really good, right? So GPA ranking class, right? Retention rates, degree attainment, different derivatives of persistence, essentially, is what we measure. We've thrown in some relatively new measures of gainful employment. But guess what? Gainful employment measures, a law school graduate gets a job as a barista. That's not a bad job. But you didn't go to law school to become a barista. At least most people don't intend to go to law school to become a barista. So my point here is that a lot of the measures we're using are not the wrong measures. They're just limited in the perspective of what they mean. And as a parent, I can't assign any weight to a GPA. I don't know what a 3.2 is at Harvard anymore. I don't know what a 3.2 is at Duke versus Stanford versus Mississippi State. I have no idea how to think about that, right? So I would say that a lot of the ways that we're measuring things are actually part of our problem. So here's a little zinger. It turns out one of the experts I get to work with is Dr. Shane Lopez. He's considered the world's expert on hope. And he actually refers to himself as the hope monger. That's a really cool job to have. It's like, I'm the hope monger, right? So Shane has literally quantified the measurement of hope. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean by that in a minute, but he's found in countless papers now published by him and other colleagues that hope is a much stronger predictor of college completion than SAT scores, ACT scores, or high school GPA. So when you put that out there, people are kind of like, wait, usually someone in the back goes, did you say hope? And I have to say, yeah, H-O-P-E, hope. One's ideas and energy for the future. It has three components. Goals, right? You have a goal for the future. The second part is pathways. You see multiple ways to achieve that goal. And the third piece is what he calls agency, right? The confidence that you can make it so. Turns out most kids are low in pathway. This is the area when we measure hope. If they're low in any of those, they usually have a goal. They usually believe they can do it. but they don't have many ways that they think they're going to accomplish it. So if you say, well, hey, you want to graduate, great, what's your way for doing that? You say, I'm going to work my butt off. Okay, well, what happens if you work your butt off and you still don't get there? You know, oh, I don't know, right? So if that's your only answer to pathway, you're low on pathways. I need to help you as a teacher find other pathways for accomplishing that goal, right? So in any event, we are not spending any time, of course, in this country measuring hope. You can do this. You can measure it, right, reliably. It's predictive of performance in very important ways, more so than what we've done with other tests. And I'll give you a quick one here. So these international standardized testing measures that PISA does, this is data in 30 countries where there's overlapping data between PISA and entrepreneur measures in the country, entrepreneurial activity. There's a negative correlation between standardized testing performance in these countries and entrepreneurial activity. Now, I don't know about you, but entrepreneurial activity is a pretty critical thing in my book. And when you look at Singapore, I was just on, actually, this is how I met the World Affairs Council here. I was on a panel with the ambassador from Singapore. They were talking about how they've killed it in standardized testing, right? They're number one in the world in math and all this stuff. What the ambassador to Singapore is worried about is the well-being of their country, because we actually, Gallup measured this, found that they experience the least emotions of any country in the world in Singapore. Interesting little side note. And they're paranoid that they don't have enough entrepreneurial activity for starting new businesses in Singapore, right? So it's just really interesting to see the countries that we feel have achieved success in this testing realm are worried about some of these other fundamental things like entrepreneurship. So in any event, I don't think we should be too worried about where we're stacking up on those international standardized test measures right now. I think we need to pause and ask a very important question. What really is the ultimate outcome of an education? Right, because I can give you two examples right now. I'll give you the one that we're measuring that would be success, right? Let's take a young woman who graduates from Harvard. She had a 1480 on her SAT, graduates with a 3.8 GPA, gets a job at Goldman Sachs making $100,000 a year. In every measure we have today, that's just outrageous success. I mean, it is, right? Every measure that we have, that's outrageous success. Now, let me give you a different story. There's a person who hates their job, has a terrible manager, doesn't like what they do each day, doesn't have a chance to do what they're best at every day. As a result, they actually have worse health, so on and so forth, right? I can keep going with this. That could be the same exact person. And in many cases, in some cases, I shouldn't say many, it is the same exact person. There's a lot of people who went through our system, did everything they were told to do, hit every measure of success possible, and still didn't get to a place where they were satisfied with what they were doing, right? Where they found ultimate flow in their life, in their work, in their careers, in their family, okay? So for whatever reason, we have to try and get that right. So I actually asked this question of 37 college presidents when I started at Gallup. And it was a one-question interview. I asked this question. And I just listened, and I just wrote down notes. And many of them actually said pretty much the same thing. They started in different places, used different words, right? But they got to this notion of describing not just a graduate who gets a job, but one who gets a job that they love, that they're, contributing to their community, that they have a happy family, they're fulfilled in every sense of it, right? I mean, it was a very impressive definition. And then I quote, any fans of Columbo here? Okay, a couple of Columbo folks. So as I'm leaving the door with this one question interview, I pulled my Columbo moment, and I went, oh, one more thing. And it's like the classic. I was like, how are you measuring that you just described? And every one of them, in a very honest way, said, we're not. The best answer that I had was from one president who very sincerely said, well, the only way we're really getting at that is through features in our alumni magazine. Stories of what great alumni were doing, right? I mean, that was their answer to how they were measuring it. So, I want to introduce you to some Gallup research that I think weighs in this. Actually, this is one of the first questions that George Gallup was obsessed with, was the life well lived. In the late 30s, he was obsessed with trying to figure out why healthy, happy, successful people got that way, right? And one of the first things we did was we studied people who lived to 100. So we interviewed every person who lived to 100 that we could find in the country. And one of the first piercing insights we learned from that, by the way, was that on average, they didn't retire until the age of 80. So think about that for a minute, right? They were also all people who described what they did in their job as something that they just loved. Their work was something that they loved. They loved what they did each day, they were doing what they were best at, and even when they retired, they were still doing something that looked suspiciously like the work they did. They just weren't getting paid for it, right? They were volunteers. So we've been obsessed with this question for a long time, and our research on this exploded when we launched the World Poll and could do it around the world. But here's essentially what we try to do. Rate your life. And your rating of your life is your rating, right? If you say, I'm a 10 on a 10-point scale, I have the best imaginable life, who am I to question that? If you say it's a 1, who am I to question it, right? What we were interested in is what things were predictive of people rating their lives highly. And it turns out there's some consistent fundamentals all over the world, no matter what language, what culture, what country, that are fundamental to how humans rate their lives. This is what we call well-being, so this is way beyond the dimension of wellness. And very quickly, these are the 5 domains that sorted in our analysis. So Gallup didn't make these up, right? These came to us through factor analysis around what essentially was predictive of how people rate their lives. And I'll talk about it in more detail, but they were the domains of career well-being, social, financial, physical, and community. And interestingly enough, in that order. They all matter, they all feed off of one another, but it turns out that career well-being is the single most important element of well-being, which is predictive of everything else. So if you have high career well-being, for example, if you can say, I like what I do each day, I do what I'm best at every day, right? There's a few other ways that we measure that. Then the chances that you're thriving in life are 4.5 times greater than somebody who's not strong in career well-being, right? So it's pretty fundamental. So let me just describe what these are. But before I do, I want to show you why they matter. It turns out well-being, by the way, is another one of those words like hope. It sounds real soft and fluffy, right? Like, you know, people usually laugh at me when I start talking about these things. They're like, what, hope, well-being, engagement, right? Turns out these are really hard measures, right? Because well-being was something that captured the world's attention when Gallup started to show, for example, that well-being was a better predictor of social unrest in countries than GDP. So in Egypt and Tunisia, leading up to Arab Spring 5 years before, GDP was going up steadily in both countries. So if you were to evaluate the health of those nations in the classic way that we evaluate the health of a nation, GDP, you would say things are going just dandy there, right? But during that same period, for whatever reason, how people were rating their lives in both countries was plummeting. And that was a much better measure of Arab Spring than anything else anybody was paying attention to. So we also have found that this matters to organizations. So when you talk about the cost of healthcare, if you have an employee who's not thriving in any domains of well-being versus one who's thriving in all 5, the healthcare cost differential to that organization is 3x, right? So this is literally a formula to avoid going bankrupt as a country, to put it another way. So this is not a soft, fluffy measure. These are real measures that matter a lot. And here's some of the things to describe. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I want to help you understand the items that people are responding to that define this, right? So it's always a 5-point scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And there's items like, I like what I do each day. I have an opportunity to do what I'm best at every day. Just think about how those are worded, right? I like what I do each day is not, what do I have fun doing? There's an element of purpose and mission in that, right? I like what I do each day. And I do what I'm best at every day. We didn't word it as once a week. We didn't word it as once a month or once a year. I have a chance to do what I'm best at every day. Those are examples of career well-being. Social is essentially about the depth of relationships in your life, not the quantity. So think about how we've got this wrong with what we espouse to kids today, right? We're encouraging them to get involved in all kinds of organizations. What do? They brag about how many friends they have on Facebook. I have 3,000 friends on Facebook, right? And you have to ask the question, is it coming at the cost of building deep, meaningful relationships with anybody, right? And if it is, then we got to be really careful about it. Maybe it's helping enhance those relationships. I don't know, but it's an important question to ask. Here's a good one for you. People with high social well-being spend 6 hours a day socializing with friends. How the heck do you do that? How do you have 6 hours a day to socialize with friends? The answer is you have to have good friends at work. If you don't, you can't possibly spend 6 hours a day socializing, right? So these worlds obviously intersect in very fascinating ways. I just want to talk about community well-being, which is a really interesting one. The average college student resume that I read who's interviewing for a job lists 17 different extracurricular activities they've been involved with. And the second I see that, I don't interview them. Because what it tells me is they probably didn't get involved in any one of those in a meaningful way. Gallup's core measure of community well-being is this item here. In the last 12 months, I've received recognition for contributions to my community. Jeff can say 5 strongly agree to that tonight. Congratulations, right? Only about 7% of people can say strongly agree to that item. But those who do, our researchers say it's the difference between a great life and a good life. This community well-being piece is like the icing on the cake. But you don't get to that place unless you've been deeply, meaningfully engaged in one or two things, right? You don't get on that list of receiving community recognition for being a member of 17 different organizations, but never really being engaged with them, right? So I worry about what we're espousing to students about listing all these involvements and showing that they did this and that. And like I said, that's okay unless it comes at the cost of getting meaningfully engaged. So let me just talk about a quick transition, and then I want to ask you a couple of questions. We measure workplace engagement, and it turns out that engagement in the workplace is very similar to engagement in schools. The fundamentals of student engagement are very consistent with the fundamentals of workplace engagement for employees. There's a few differences and nuances that are important, but there's simple ones that come through. One of the key items in workplace engagement is that they have a supervisor or manager who cares about them. It turns out in schools that one of the critical items is having a teacher who cares about you, right? Jeff talked about this, about showing students that he cares about them so that they care about their work. I mean, literally, this is an example of what we're talking about. But that word care is fundamental throughout. We actually did a poll of this. We asked Americans to think about the best teacher they ever had. So the prompt was, put that person's name in your head, right? So probably several of them thought about Jeff. Mine was Alma Blunt. And then we asked them open-ended to describe what made them their best teacher. The number one word Americans used, open-ended, to describe their best teacher is care. It's so simple. The good news about what I have to say tonight is that getting back to a place of winning again in education, however we want to define it, it's not overly complicated. It's about getting back to the basics, to the fundamentals of human development, and that care element is one of those. So let me just quickly show you a couple examples of some things that I think relate to this, and then I just want it to be open discussion. We just did a recent study looking at young Americans, representative sample of 18 to 35-year-olds. We were interested in their educational experience and what was predictive of work success. So we were interested in a whole host of things, 21st century skills. We asked all kinds of questions about, did you use technology to complete an assignment? Did you learn about other cultures and other countries? Did you present? Did you have to synthesize data, right? All these things that got at elements of critical thinking, etc. So it turned out that there were 2 items that were strongly predictive of work success. So if you said in school or college, right? So we, by the way, as a representative sample, we interviewed high school grads, college grads, people with no degree whatsoever, right? We just said in your last year of school, did you experience these things? If you said yes to these 2 things, you were twice as likely to be successful in your job. Number one, that you worked on long-term projects that took more than a few classes to complete. So I had dinner with Jeff tonight, and he described what he was working on. And it was literally that, a 6-month project that his students go through, right? That would definitely qualify, right? A long-term project that took more than a few classes to complete. The second one that stood out was that they applied what they were learning to a real-world problem. Wow, I mean, when I say these 2 things, you're like, well, duh, that sounds really simple and straightforward. Those 2 things are twice as likely to predict success in the workplace if those are experiences students have in school. Interestingly enough, we saw a big difference between high school grads and college grads on working on a long-term project. If you were a college grad, you're almost twice as likely to say that than high school. But here's a kicker for colleges. There was very little difference between applying what you were learning to a real-world problem. High school and college were pretty similar, 22 versus 27%. And on the critical measure of having supervisors or teachers who care about your development, got a newsflash for you, high schools are doing better than college. High school only grads were much more likely to say that they felt they had teachers who cared about their feelings or problems than college grads. And the same thing with knowing about their hopes and dreams, right? So let me just pause there. I hope I've given you a lot of food for thought. I'll share a couple other thoughts as we go through, but I just kind of want to dive in and hear what kind of questions and comments and reactions you'll have. So.
You were going to follow up on engagement and what that meant.
Yes.
One of your earlier slides. Is
Yeah.
that?
So I've kind of mentioned a couple of them. So some of the ways we measure engagement are on items like in the last week I've received praise or recognition for work that I've done. I like what I do each day. In school I have the chance to do what I'm best at every day. I have a best friend at school. That's a critical one for students. So students who say I have a best friend at school, much more likely to complete school. They usually have about a full grade point average higher than their friends who say they don't. I mean, really fascinating stuff. So there's several items that as an index measure engagement, but Gallup's definition of engagement are really emotional attachment levels, right? I mean, they're not activity. It's not how many hours did you spend studying. They're kind of fundamental emotional levels of engagement. So I'm actually happy to share our student surveys that we use on engagement, both our workplace ones and our student ones. And our Gallup student poll actually is a free poll that we run every October. Every school in the country can participate free of charge. So I would highly encourage the schools in Montana to sign up and literally just go to gallupstudentpoll.com and register. It's something that several states are actually considering encouraging the whole state to do. So the good news is it's free. So if you're interested in measuring that at a school level and having some national comparison and things like that, that's something free that they can, any school in the state can sign up for. So, yes, sir.
I happen to think that the parents perhaps are more a problem than the teachers of the school. And I'd just like to hear what you might say about that. I mean, I understand there's too much criticism of, our schools, our teachers, they're not letting the right things
Right.
on the board.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that we've got too many kids who go to school in this country without the right motivation from at home. And what do we do about that?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. So let me categorically throw two groups under the bus right now. I'll throw parents under the bus, and I'm going to throw business leaders under the bus. Now, I'm going to be very critical, right? Because there's obviously a lot of great parents out there who are doing great parenting. But I would say that both of them become guilty at a national level of assuming that schools are going to take care of everything, right? Like, here's my kid, go make them, smart and whatever, right? And I don't have any responsibility in it, right? Businesses are doing the same thing in that I think they've shirked their responsibility to offer internships, mentorships, externships, right? I mean, how many teachers and college faculty members have worked in a real business? A lot of them have been in academia their whole lives, right? So to think about businesses criticizing schools, trying to hold schools accountable for certain outcomes, at the end of the day, I think they should be looking at themselves too. Schools can't solve all this. Even the best schools and teachers in the world, right? We're still going to be short a ton of mentors. We're still going to be short a ton of experiential opportunities, right? So it's not as easy as just saying, well, the school's going to take care of it. So I think to your point, there's a lot of parents who just think that school should fix this problem with my kid, right? And not necessarily owning their relationship. Now, here's the good news. Even if you got bum parents, the biggest predictor of your engagement in school is not your parents. They play a strong role. It's your teacher. So you can have no parents. You could have some bum parents, right? You could have a parent, checked out parent, all these, kinds of scenarios. And if you have a great teacher who cares about you, that's much more predictive of your engagement than anything else, right? So the strongest intervention in a student's life from an engagement perspective in school is their teacher. So, that's good news, right? But at the same time, you're kind of asking the question, how do we get parents more engaged? I don't have great answers other than that. It's the same way that I think we get businesses more engaged. We start to hold them accountable in the same way that they try to hold us accountable. So I got a simple idea. I think it should be required for every business in the state to offer internships and mentorships to high school students. It should be a requirement. And if you don't do it, you should pay extra taxes. Simple proposal. Right? And I'm not just talking about Montana. I'd vote for that for the whole country. So in any event, I just think all of us have to own our responsibility in this, including students, by the way. Students can't just show up and be passive learners. They've got to take ownership of this too. So the ownership gets spread all around, I think.
It's a good segue when you're saying about taxes. How do you take political climate in this country right now, which is moving large, it's moving the Titanic.
Yeah.
So how do you as Gallup, which has this information, how do you disseminate that to decision makers that are from the top down or bottom up, getting access to this information, assessing it, talking about it with the unions, teachers, communities? You understand the complexity of this issue. So how are you taking this information and taking that next step to start dialoguing with these different entities? And if you are, what kind of feedback, what kind of results are you starting to see as you talk to them about this?
I mean, it made me sweat, made me feel like I've got a big job. I mean, which you know, I tell you, this is interesting. I took this job at Gallup for this very opportunity. Gallup's in such a unique place, right? We're an independent organization, privately held. We're not a publicly traded company. We're not a government agency, right? I mean, we're trying to unearth the will of the people. I mean, that was George Gallup's original vision. It wasn't to predict political races. It was try to understand the will of the people and to help leaders understand that and get the premise right. That's a big responsibility that we have. And the short answer is that every way we can, we're trying to disseminate that. Right? So this forum today is a really important example of that. I mean, it's a lot of what I'm supposed to be doing in my day job is getting out and translating a lot of this research into simple ways that have actionable steps. So we're doing a lot of writing about this. We're doing a lot of communication with the education associations in DC. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to do this, but I wouldn't want Arnie Duncan's job right now. I wouldn't want him. Arnie Duncan is right now scared to talk about Common Core because he's worried that if he talks about it, it'll look like it's a federal initiative and that will actually undermine it, right? So one of the most important reforms that we have going on in the education world in the United States is something that our Secretary of Education won't even weigh in on because he's worried about how it's going to come out in the political wash, right? Now, I don't know Arnie Duncan. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. Full disclosure, I'm a strong independent, okay? But I think he's a great guy. I just know that in his role, he's kind of tied from doing something important around Common Core. It's just a great example of how we've got an awful lot of issues in DC, awful lot of issues in politics. But I tell you what I do. I go out and I talk to organizations, parents, teachers, students all over the place. And when I talk about this stuff, it happens to resonate. Why does it resonate? Because it's their voices that made this data real, right? So I look at the data, I hear a story like Jeff talked about what he's doing in the classroom, and it's exactly in line with what we know is leading to success from a research perspective. So it very much, I think, is our obligation to disseminate it. But the reason why I'm encouraged by this is that people get excited, right? They get excited at the idea of trying to figure out how to get students back to figuring out what they like to do, what they do best, right? They get excited by a lot of these things. So I think there's a lot of natural momentum. You look at Texas, this is a great example. The state that led the effort towards standardized testing, they're the first state backing off of it right now. And there's parents there that are just fed up on standardized testing. They want something different, right? So, you know, now I'm not arguing we get rid of standardized testing. I'll be really clear with that. But the pendulum is swinging all the way back on that, right? It needs to be put in its rightful place. Standardized testing might predict 7% of the variance of student success beyond school, right? So in any event, I think there's natural momentum that's going to carry this.
That's my next question. You bring up Texas.
Yeah.
Is it just a natural momentum? Are there people who are leading that charge? And why would the political class be listening to that? That's happening. So there's always a dynamic somewhere that's moving things in one direction or another. So what insight can you share?
I see parents and teachers driving most of those actions.
So it's coming more from the local as opposed to top down.
Absolutely. And then good politicians are listening to those parents and teachers because they're important constituents, right? And so, you know, I do hear smart conversations happening at the higher levels, but I also hear, like, for example, if I talk to a business audience, they want to hold schools accountable, right? Measure outcomes, right? I mean, they're really hardcore about that because that's kind of how they think about their world. And then guess what I do? I show them that slide that shows a negative correlation between standardized testing and entrepreneurial activity. And the room's like, whoa, okay, wait, right? I mean, if you give people the right information, right, if they get the premise right, leaders are going to start making better decisions. I actually believe in that. Now, it's not always the case, right? We have a lot of leaders that make political decisions, not the right leadership decisions. That's always going to happen. But I actually have a great belief that the momentum in the United States, driven by parents, driven by teachers, driven by students. I don't know if you know the name Nikhil Goya. Have you ever heard that name? He wrote a book. He was a high school senior, wrote a book, and talk about how education is failing students. It's a bestseller. He's 18 years old. This is a student-driven change that's happening because students are getting exposure to a different way of learning, and they don't want to go back to the traditional classroom where they're just getting lectured at all day. So all these things, I think, are going to naturally drive change. So it's not going to be led by politicians. Politicians are going to be led by their constituents on this. That's my theory. Yeah, Steve.
You travel around the country on what kind of programs or schools have you come across that are actually doing the things that your polling suggests should be done with students?
Well, I don't say it just because he's on the stage tonight, but Jeff's a great example, right? I mean, everything he was talking about, I was just sitting there listening. I'm like, check, 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 right? From the research perspective, I mean, his anecdotal stories, what's happening in the classroom. So here's a good one, right? Everybody's all caught up on technology. We think that if we put an iPad in every classroom, we're going to solve all the problems, right? Whoa, not so fast. This is coming from a guy who built an online education company, right? So I see it in its rightful place. But I went to New Tech High in Napa Valley, California. And by its name, you would think that the big story there is about technology, right? And it's true. When you walk in the place, every kid's got their own personal, computer, right? Whatever. So it's a wired school. But the real story was not technology. It was project-based learning. They were doing project-based learning in every single class, regardless of the subject. They were applying everything they learned to a real-world problem. And you're like, well, how can you do that? Everybody gets the example of like science. You build a rocket, you shoot, right? It's like a simple example to do project-based learning there. I went to their intro to Spanish class. And this is what they were doing that day. The teacher gave them an assignment, groups of 3, to come up with an imaginary vacation to a Latin American country. To design a postcard, to think about what they were doing on that vacation. They would write that message on the back of the postcard and send it home. So they had to figure out, I'm going to go parasailing. How do you say parasailing in Spanish? And, right? And so some of them were working on the sentence construction, but they had to imagine this vacation, right? This tropical destination they might go to. They designed the postcard, so there was graphic design elements involved with this, right? And yeah, they were using the internet for research, but it was the brilliance of a simple example of a teacher thinking about a great project through which they could learn Spanish. I guarantee you those kids who decided they were going parasailing in their imaginary vacation will never forget what parasailing is in Spanish, right? But here's the interesting thing. So at the end of it, there was a woman who was in charge of the district's curriculum for project-based learning. And I said, how did you get your job? Like, what training did you have that taught you how to do project-based learning? She said, I didn't. I just started doing it in my classroom. I got good at it. They wanted me to teach everybody else in the district, so I took the job, right? So she just learned it on the fly. But her point was, so in other words, all of her education training, every program that she went through, there was no emphasis on project-based learning. She figured it out on the fly. But the second she figured it out, she'll never go back to any other model, right? Because she sees how engaged the students get. So most of the examples that I think of where I see success, they're very simple ingredients. There's teachers who care about their students and show it on a daily basis. They figure out how to get kids to a place where they're exploring what they like to do and what they do best at every day. And so that's been part of what we've written a lot about. Our new Student Bill of Rights is what we've been calling it. There's just 3 fundamental things. Teachers who care, liking what you do, and doing what you're best at every day. If you can figure out how to get students in an environment where those things are happening, everything else is going to take care of itself. So, they're all similar examples. Yes?
You never finished. You alluded to the outcome. We always have a deficit.
Yeah.
So you never said what the
Yeah. So, thanks for that question. The best Gallup research we've ever done is on what I call human development. So Don Clifton, who was a professor at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, he's now officially considered the father of strength psychology. 40 years ago, he had a real interesting question. He was trained as a psychologist, and every book on psychology was about why sick people were sick. Right, I mean, that's the field of psychology, largely, right? Like what makes sick people sick, what makes unhealthy people unhealthy. And he was just interested in studying what made successful people successful. So in the first studies that he did, and then subsequent studies where Gallup did, for example, we did the largest study of leaders in the world, some 45,000 leaders and managers. We started to find some really consistent themes. They were all people who figured out what they were good at and just focused on that for the rest of their lives. They didn't try and fix weaknesses. They figured out what they were good at, and they became excellent at those things, right? So it's very counter to what we do in schools right now, because if we test you, we're testing you to look for what you don't know. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out what you don't know. Now, understand, there's a difference when I say weaknesses. If you're illiterate, right, you need to address that weakness. I mean, we need students to be literate, right? So I'm not talking about those examples of weaknesses. I'm talking about how people are naturally hardwired for success, right? So, so this is what stimulated all of our research in strengths assessment. Some of you may be familiar with our Strengths Finder tool. But the long story short is that's probably the biggest insight we've unearthed, is that weaknesses don't grow. Strengths are infinite. And if you figure out what you're good at and put it to work on a daily basis, that's the secret to success in life. So as we think about transitioning this model from a deficit-based approach to a strengths-based approach, just think about if we focused on, in reviews for employees, what you're doing well as opposed to constructive criticism, right? Gallup, actually, when we do reviews, there's no commentary on constructive criticism. We have reviews and we talk about our strengths. That's it, that's our review, right? I mean, it sounds so counterintuitive to how we do things. Think about if we did that with students. If we sat down and we said, well, you know, okay, I know what your grades are and all this other thing, but what are you really good at? I mean, you can ask somebody that question. You can also give them different experiences to help get them there. But it's essentially moving from a deficit-based model to a strengths-based lens in terms of how we think about people and how we think about their development. So, so that's pretty fundamental.
I have time for one more.
Yeah.
If I understand what you've been saying in all of this, you're really talking about what I would call the emotional or affective domain. And my question is, in the long run, how can you change an educational system that is not based on emotional affective domain, it's based on the cognitive domain? Yeah. And what are the steps to change that?
Yeah. So it's not easy, right? I mean, none of this that we're trying to do in the education world is easy work, so I'm not going to undermine it by just saying I have some magical answer, right? At the same time, I'm incredibly optimistic because moving the needle is a lot easier than I think we believe it is, right? So, simple example, we're not going to throw out standardized testing. My argument is we need to de-emphasize the importance we put on it. Right? So cognitive testing, I think, is still a very important element, right? But an example of work that Gallup is doing, and we're not alone in this, there's other people who are measuring these things. Angela Duckworth has become famous talking about measuring grit. You know, some of you may know Paul Tufts' book, How Children Succeed, where he talks about grit and resilience and all these other things, right? So in Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland, we're measuring student engagement and teacher and staff engagement in the entire district. You can measure this stuff reliably. It's predictive of key performance indicators. We measure it for some of the best Fortune 500 companies in the world because they know that if they improve employee engagement, that improves customer engagement, that improves revenue, that improves profit, that improves stock price. We literally have an economic model that shows that those things drive one another, right? So the reason why companies give a crap about employee engagement is because we've been able to show a tie in the research between employee engagement leading to better profits, right, and higher stock price. Now, of course, good leaders care about people too, but that connection is pretty important. So where I'm going with this is that Montgomery County Schools has not stopped standardized testing. They're measuring that. But they've now added a whole other dimension that they've said in their strategic plan is important. They're measuring the engagement of students and the engagement of the teachers and the staff in their buildings, all the way to the bus drivers. Because Josh Starr, the superintendent, says the first and last person the kid sees every day is their bus driver, right? And he's nailed it, right? If you don't have an engaged bus driver, you're at a disadvantage compared to one who is, right? So I think it's as simple as starting to take these steps where a school district, a state, a leader starts to say, whoa, wait, we believe in these measures, but we also are going to start to look at some of these others that we know are really important. We bring a rounded scorecard to this thing, and what we're going to start to find is, as they have in Montgomery, we can start to predict student performance on tests by whether their engagement needle is moving with students. Testing, by the way, is a trailing indicator. It's what students did in the past. So if I know how a school did on the state standardized test, that's what they did the months before, right? It says nothing about where that school is headed in the future. It doesn't necessarily predict future performance, but the engagement measures will. So, you know, if you get examples of some leading school districts, leading universities, right? You don't need 1,000 to start with this. You get 10 good ones, right? 10 ones that everybody's looking at. That's going to be 100. That's going to be 1,000. And that's going to put the pressure on kind of the state, you know, federal, other legislative bodies to start to pay attention. I think starting there is like hitting your head up against the wall. So start with the leaders who are willing to take the step. Parents, teachers, right? I mean, there's teachers in buildings that are leaders. They take that step and they're a model for the other teachers. And before you know it, everybody else wants to be like Jeff, right? So it's a good question. All right, I'll be hanging around for a little while, so feel free to chat.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you for all your questions and for coming. We have some desserts and a cash bar in the back if you want to stick around and ask them any questions. And I just want to offer you a little token of our appreciation, a little glacier book. Take home a piece of Montana since you didn't make it up there.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks for taking me there personally.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope we'll do that.
Yeah, not the same, but we know it's not the same, but he doesn't. All right, so please help yourselves with the desserts, and thanks for coming.